Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swami Tapaharine Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramartanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Welcome everyone to our ongoing class on the Bhagavad Gita. Last time we discussed up to Shloka 52 of chapter 2. And the thing we were discussing is that the Shloka seems to be saying that when you have attained illumination, spiritual illumination, you will cross beyond the delusion. You'll cross beyond all delusion and become indifferent to Shruti. And then the question is, what does Shruti mean in this context? And I mentioned that many of the traditional commentators, they were uncomfortable saying that Shruti means Vedic scriptures. So they came up with other meanings. So in that context, let's look at the next shloka to see whether the next shloka, 53, gives us any clues. Notice that it starts with the word Shruti. So what I'll do is as usual, I'll recite one part of the shloka and then please repeat after me. Shruti vipratipanna te yada sthasyati nishchala samadhavachala buddhihi tada yogamavapsyasi. Okay, so now please look at the Anvaya. I'm assuming you all have your app. Yeah. Okay, Shruti vipratipanna te. Now, both of these words, Shruti and vipratipanna, have been variously interpreted by commentators. So I can't give one universal meaning. But most commentators take this to mean bewildered. Vipratipanna in this context, most commentators, except Ramanuja, and maybe some others, but among the ones I'm studying, Ramanuja has a very different interpretation. I'll mention it soon. But in general, bewildered. By what? By Shruti. And here, Shruti has different meanings as well. So that's, as I said, this is one of those controversial words, what exactly it means. So we'll talk about it. But bewildered by Shruti, te buddhihi, when your intelligence, te buddhihi means your intelligence, your buddhi is bewildered by Shruti. Yada means when. Samadho, in samadhi. Yada samadho nischala achala sthasyati. When in samadhi, in an unshakable, nischala, achala, so it means more or less the same thing, nischala and achala, without any chala, yeah? Sthasyati. When your buddhi, when your intelligence stands grounded in unshakable samadhi. Again, the word samadhi is also open to interpretation. So I'm just going to use the Sanskrit word, samadhi. Tada, then, yogam avapsyasi. You will attain yoga. Okay, now, first of all, notice again the word Shruti. So most commentators take this Shruti to have the same meaning as the Shrotavyasya Shrutasya in the previous shloka. Same thing. But they have different understandings of what Shruti means. So let's start with Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Do you see the bottom, on the bottom second from the left? That includes Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the shlokas. So let me read it. Sri Aurobindo says, it is not surprising at all, one may observe in passing, that with the conflict of so many philosophical schools, all founding themselves on the texts of the Veda and Upanishads, the Gita should describe the understanding as being perplexed and confused, led in different directions by the Shruti Vipratipanna. What battles are even now delivered by Indian pundits and metaphysicians over the meaning of the ancient texts, and to what different conclusions they lead? The understanding may well get disgusted and indifferent. Gantasi nirvedam. He's referring to the previous shloka. Refuse to hear any more texts, new or old. Shrotavyasya shutasya. and go into itself to discover the truth in the light of a deeper and inner and direct experience. So some of us may be feeling like this too, because from the beginning I mentioned I'm not going to rely on one commentary. I'm going to bring in different commentaries, sometimes comparing them, with the aim of trying to get at the original meaning of each shloka, but it can be bewildering. And so Sri Aurobindo bites the bullet and says that we should take Shruti here to mean the scriptures, including Vedas. This word does not exclude the Vedas. And what he's saying is, so long as we're spiritual aspirants, so long as we've not realized the spiritual goal, there will always be some confusion about the scriptures, and we might even be misled. We might get too involved in the sort of subtle interpretive controversies and these kinds of things, and lose sight of the important spiritual messages. So we're finally able to transcend all these confusions only when we attain the highest spiritual realization. This is what the shloka seems to be saying. So Sri Aurobindo's translation of the shloka is, when thy intelligence, which is bewildered by the Shruti, shall stand unmoving and stable in samadhi, then shalt thou attain to yoga. Now, as I said, the word samadhi also, before we get to samadhi, I mentioned that Ramanuja is one of the few commentators to interpret vipratipanna in a totally different way. How does he interpret it? Almost like the opposite. So he says, and even Shruti is completely different. Shruti literally means hearing, right? So he takes it in its etymological sense. And he says, what does Shruti vipratipanna mean? It means well enlightened by hearing from me. Krishna is speaking to Arjuna and he's saying, once you have heard my great spiritual teachings and you become enlightened through them, then you will rest in this achala samadhi. And he does this in a very interesting way by parsing this vipratipanna as visheshataha pratipanna. It's almost, so vipratipanna typically means bewildered. He's taking it in a very positive sense, which means enlightened. Especially enlightened by Shruti in this sense, meaning by hearing my great teachings, my great spiritual teachings. So it's a very different interpretation, but this is another way that we're seeing the ingenuity of these traditional commentators in making the scriptures say what they want them to say, because he does not want to bring in Shruti in the sense of Vedic scriptures here. And it's like a blasphemy to say that the enlightened person would be bewildered by the Vedas. So he's trying to avoid it. But Sri Aurobindo seems to accept that. Now, as I said, the next word which is controversial is samadho, samadhi. In samadhi. What does samadhi mean? It has different meanings. Sometimes ecstasy, in other contexts, in modern Indian language, like in Bangla, for instance, it can also mean like a funeral. Mahasamadhi means when you leave the body, but it's also a kind of spiritual trance state. And then there are many different kinds of samadhi in different spiritual schools. So in Vedantic schools, we have, especially Advaita Vedanta, there's Nirvikalpa samadhi. There's also Bhava samadhi for bhaktas. And now this question is, what is this samadhi? I'll just give you a few interpretations. Shankara, one thing that you'll find is that many of these traditional commentators, they don't tend to emphasize samadhi in the sense of spiritual trance states until much later in the medieval times, sort of post, I can't give an exact date, but you don't find much of an emphasis in the early commentators on samadhi in the sense of these states of spiritual trance. So predictably, Shankara does not interpret it as spiritual trance. He takes Okay, welcome back. Can you hear me? I hope you can.
Yes, yes.
Okay, technical difficulties? Thank you. So, because we got interrupted for a few minutes, I'm going to repeat what I said about Ramanuja's interpretation of the first phrase, Shruti Vipratipanna. Most people take Vipratipanna, this is Shloka 2.53. Chapter 2, Shloka 53. Most commentators take Vipratipanna to mean bewildered, So we mean bewildered by Shruti. Ramanuja says Vipratipanna means well enlightened by Shruti. And here he takes Shruti to mean hearing my great teachings, meaning Sri Krishna's great teachings. And one of the main reasons he interprets it this way is to avoid the problem of interpreting Shruti as the Vedic scriptures, because an enlightened person should not be bewildered by the Vedic scriptures. That's his idea. Now we come to the second controversial word in this shloka, samadhi, in the second line. Samadho means in samadhi. What does samadhi mean? According to Shankara, samadhi means the Atman, the non-dual Atman, not a state of spiritual trance, which is one of the most common meanings these days. Many saints, if you look at 20th century saints like Ramana Maharshi or Sri Ramakrishna, when they talk about samadhi, they mean spiritual states of trance. What do I mean by trance? Typically, they involve being oblivious to the external world. You're so absorbed in God, whether God is understood as non-dual Brahman or as the personal God, that you just you forget about everything that's going on in this world. There are other forms of samadhi. We'll get to that soon. But this is one of the typical understandings of samadhi. Shankara says this has nothing to do with spiritual states of trance. It just means the Atman. So samadhau means, in samadhi means in the Atman. When you stand firm in the Atman, then you are no longer bewildered by Shruti. And here he takes Shruti not to mean all the Vedas, but just the Karma Kanda of the Vedas. The portion of the Vedas which tells us to engage in ritualistic actions. Again, that's his way of, like Ramanuja, he doesn't want to say that it includes the Upanishads because those are the highest teachings. Okay, so that's Shankara's interpretation of samadho. In samadhi means in the Atman, standing firm in the Atman. Ramanuja interprets samadhi as a pure mind, the pure mind. Again, not spiritual trance. And Sri Aurobindo takes it to mean actually samadhi, which is a state of spiritual absorption, but a very special kind of samadhi. And we're going to get to that in the next shloka, because the next shloka also has the word samadhi, and that's where Sri Aurobindo explains his understanding of it in more detail. Okay, so now let's get to this extremely interesting next shloka, shloka 54. After listening to so many of Bhagavan Krishna's teachings, Arjuna has a question, a burning question. What is the question? Arjuna uvacha sthita prajnasya ka bhasha samadhisthasya keshava sthitadihi kim prabhasheta kimasita vrajeta kim. Anvaya, Arjuna uvacha. Arjuna says, he asks the following question. Hey Keshava, O Krishna, samadhistasya sthita prajnasya ka bhasha. That person who sthita prajna means whose intelligence is steady or whose wisdom is steady. So a person of steady wisdom, an enlightened person, an illumined soul. Samadhistasya. Stha means standing in, standing firmly in what? In samadhi. That same word samadhi from the previous shloka. That person who is enlightened, who is standing firm in samadhi, ka bhasha. Bhasha is also open to interpretation. It can mean different things in different contexts. What does it mean in Hindi, for instance? It's speech, yeah, exactly. So you might think, well, he's asking, well, what is the speech of an enlightened person like? But there's an issue with that interpretation. What? Let's keep looking. The problem is, let's look at keep going with the Anvaya. Sthita dhihi, which means a person of steady intelligence, dhihi. Kim prabhasheta. The very next question is, prabhasheta means, how does he speak? So if bhasha also means speech, there seems to be a redundancy. So the commentators say we can't have that kind of redundancy. Arjuna asking the same question twice. How does the enlightened person speak? And how does he speak? So they have to interpret bhasha and prabhasheta in different ways. Okay, we're going to get to that. So everybody more or less takes prabhasheta to mean how does he speak? But they have to interpret bhasha differently then. So we'll get to that. Kim asita. How does he sit? He or she. How does the enlightened person sit? Kim vrajeta. How does the enlightened person walk around? Yeah? It's a very funny question, actually, in some ways. So first of all, bhasha. In order to avoid this apparent redundancy between bhasha and prabhasheta, they say prabhasheta means Arjuna is asking, how does an enlightened person speak? What does he talk about? Bhasha here means, there's nothing wrong with this in terms of Sanskrit. They interpret it to mean, what are the characteristics of an enlightened being? And the way that Shankara puts it is very clever. He says, how do others describe the enlightened person? Describe, like description. Bhasha can also mean description. So how is the enlightened person described by others? And then Arjuna asks these three main things, all very external. He's not asking about the internal state of the enlightened person. He's saying, how does this person talk? How does the person walk? How does the person sit? Which is very funny. What does it mean? How does he sit? In Padmasana or Ardha Padmasana or who knows, Sukhasana? So Sri Aurobindo has a very insightful commentary on this. So I think this is one of the few places where the app, am I right in thinking that the app, okay, no, we'll get to that. No, unfortunately, the app is not good on this. But okay. Bhasha means description. What are the signs of an illumined soul? Now, samadhi, the word samadhi again. And as I promised, I wanted to mention Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Let's listen carefully. How does Sri Aurobindo interpret the word samadhi here? The illumined person who is standing firm in samadhi. Unfortunately, it's not in the app, so I'm going to read it slowly. The sign of the man in samadhi is not that he loses consciousness of objects and surroundings and of his mental and physical self, and cannot be recalled to it even by burning or torture of the body. The ordinary idea of the matter. I told you this is a very common understanding of samadhi is you're in a cave and you're deep in meditation and you become so absorbed in the spiritual reality that you completely lose external consciousness. Sri Aurobindo says that's a legitimate kind of samadhi, but that's not what's being talked about here. On the battlefield to a warrior. And Krishna is trying to convince the warrior to fight in a war. So he's saying that it wouldn't make sense in this context to think of samadhi in that state. How can you be in the state of samadhi while fighting in a war? This is a remarkable thing. So keep this in mind. Now, Sri Aurobindo continues. Trance is a particular intensity, not the essential sign of samadhi. Then he says, the test of samadhi is the expulsion of all desires. He's anticipating the beginning of Krishna's response, the next shloka, which we're about to get to. Rajahati yada kaman. Okay. The test of samadhi is an internal test, is the expulsion of all desires, their inability to get at the mind. And it is the inner state from which this freedom arises, the delight of the soul gathered within itself with the mind equal and still and high poised above the attractions and repulsions, the alternations of sunshine and storm and stress of the external life. It is drawn inward even when acting outwardly. It is drawn inward even when acting outwardly. You can be fighting in a battle and at the same time be in samadhi. It is concentrated in self, meaning that the soul, the spiritual, eternal spiritual soul, even when gazing out upon things. It is directed wholly to the divine, even when to the outward vision of others, busy and preoccupied with the affairs of the world. Okay, so I think this is a very original and very helpful reading of this word samadhi in both shloka 54, samadhi stasya keshava, and in the previous shloka, samadhau. Especially in the context of Krishna's dialogue with Arjuna on the battlefield, addressing a kshatriya who's supposed to fight in this just war. Okay, very good. Again, one way to call this, Sri Aurobindo doesn't use the word as far as I'm aware, but it's a word that's in common currency nowadays. Does anyone know what would this samadhi be called? This kind of samadhi in which you can still be talking in a very ordinary way with other. Sahaja samadhi. Yeah, exactly. Sahaja samadhi. It means a natural samadhi. It's not some special state of trance where you lose external consciousness. Outwardly, you're behaving like anybody else. One of the most remarkable examples is Nisargadatta Maharaj, who is in Mumbai, a great realized soul. And it's very funny. If you see, there's some videos of him on YouTube. You just look it up and you'll see. Just looks like very ordinary person, talking like an ordinary person, shouting at the top of his lungs sometimes. The fan going in the background. It's very funny. I realize so. So the true sign of somebody in the state of samadhi, illumination, isn't internal. Is that person free from desire? That's the essential sign. Not, is this person oblivious to the world and this kind. Okay. Now, so let's finally start looking at Sri Bhagavan's, Sri Krishna's response to Arjuna's question, because you might find it surprising. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Prajahati Yada Kaman Sarvan Partha Manogatan Atmani Evatmana Tushtaha Sthita Prajnas Tadochyate Anvaya. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha. So this is the very first shloka responding to Arjuna's question. We're now on shloka 55. Bhagavan Krishna says the following in response to Arjuna. Hey Partha, O Arjuna. Yada, when Manogatan Sarvan Kaman, all the desires, Kaman means worldly desires, selfish attachments. Manogatan, in the mind. Prajahati, when one has completely eliminated all of the desires in the mind. Atmana Atmani eva tushtaha. Atmana, tushta means completely satisfied or contented. In the self, by the self. Atmani Atmana. Tada, then, sthita prajnaha uchyate. Then that person can be rightly called a person of steady wisdom. Now, a question. What might be strange about this first line response to Arjuna's question? Arjuna asks, how does an enlightened person speak? How does the person sit? How does the person walk? And this is Sri Krishna's first answer. What might be strange about it? Yeah, it seems almost like a non sequitur. Arjuna is asking about external signs and Krishna basically ignores him, or seems to, at least seems to. Again, we're going to get to one commentator. I'll get to him in a second. He's a follower of Shankara named Sridhara, who somehow, it's in a very clever way, because it goes on, Krishna's answer goes on for a few shlokas, tries to show where in particular shlokas, Krishna is answering the three main questions. Arjuna says, how does the enlightened person, first of all, how does he speak? Second, sit, and then walk. So Sridhara will say that, oh, this shloka is answering the question about speaking. How does he speak? And then this shloka is explaining how he sits. So we'll get to that in a second. But most commentators, they don't go into that. They say that he's not giving external signs. He's not answering Arjuna's question in that way. He's shifting the terms of the question, actually. He's saying the question is wrong, because the true sign of enlightenment is not external. The enlightened person can behave exactly like an ordinary person externally. He can speak the same way, he can walk the same way, he can sit and stand in the same way as any ordinary unenlightened person. The true test is internal. Okay, and I want to see here. Yeah, this is one place where the app thankfully has a useful commentary. Can you go to the bottom second to the left? Arjuna, voicing the average human mind, asks for some outward, physical, practically discernible sign of this great samadhi. How does such a man speak? How sit? How walk? No such signs can be given, nor does the teacher attempt to supply them. For the only possible test of its possession is inward, and that there are plenty of hostile psychological forces to apply. I have read this last phrase several times, and I've never figured out whether it's a typo. I can't figure out how it fits into the sentence. This and that there are plenty of hostile psychological forces to apply. I'm just throwing this out there. If anybody can crack this puzzle, I thought I was good in English, but apparently, I think there might be something wrong with the English, or maybe I'm what?
Put that person in stress or make him feel psychologically up or down to test if he's equine.
That's true, but I'm wondering about the grammar. That throws me off. I don't see how that works in the sentence. I'll read it for the benefit of the online audience. If you're curious about what I'm puzzled about, I'll just read it one more time. Sri Aurobindo says, for the only possible test of its possession means this kind of sahaja samadhi, where you're absorbed in God while still acting outwardly in the world. The only possible test of its possession is inward, and that there are plenty of hostile psychological forces to apply. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on this longer. And so you can test, the test of whether you're in samadhi is, there are all sorts of things that you can test yourself with, whether you get angry in particular circumstances, or feel desire in the face of certain sense objects, maybe. But still, the question of the grammar is what bugs me. I don't know what that is doing in the sentence. Anyway, then let me finish what Sri Aurobindo says here. Equality is the great stamp of the liberated soul. Samatva is the term used in the previous shloka. And of that equality, even the most discernible signs are still subjective. The only signs of a realized soul the only true signs are subjective ones, never objective ones, never external ones. This is the main point. Okay. Now, I wanted to mention, Shankara has a wonderful insight here. With regard to, now, just to give you a sense of what see, from Sloka 55 all the way up to the end of this chapter, which is Sloka 72, Bhagavan Krishna is answering Arjuna's question, but in a way by giving a very different kind, by, as I said, shifting the terms of the question, saying you're on a wild goose chase if you're looking for external characteristics of an illumined being, but I'm going to explain to you in great detail the internal signs. Now, what does Shankara say? Or the context here for what Shankara's saying is this. We might think as ordinary, we're all, at best, we're spiritual aspirants. We're here because we're spiritual aspirants, but most of us are not realized souls yet. We're working on it. You might wonder, well, these are great. These are the characteristics we're going to find one by one. When there are no desires in our heart, when we're completely indifferent to what comes, whether good or bad, all these wonderful things. But how does that apply to us? How is it relevant to us as spiritual aspirants who are very far from the goal of illumination, God realization? This is the context in which Shankara makes a very beautiful observation. I'm going to read it in Sanskrit because the Sanskrit is also very beautiful, and then I'll explain. Shankara says, Sarvatra eva hi adhyatma shastre, in all scriptures relating to adhyatma, spirituality, kritatha lakshanani yani, tani eva sadhanani upadishyante yatna sadhyatva. In all the scriptures without exception dealing with spirituality, whatever are the characteristics of the man of realization, of the realized soul, are themselves presented as the sadhanas, as spiritual disciplines for the spiritual aspirant. Because these characteristics are the result of effort. It's a very beautiful idea. The idea is, how are all these descriptions of the realized soul relevant to us who are not realized? Because what comes naturally to these realized souls, we have to try to cultivate as spiritual aspirants through spiritual practice. So that complete equanimity in the face of adversity, in the face of sense pleasures, that we have to try to cultivate in our own lives as spiritual aspirants, and so on and so forth. Do you see what I mean? So then it's the reason why I like this, and this is a very famous kind of statement in Shankara's commentary, is because it makes us directly relevant to us as spiritual aspirants. So always keep this in mind. You can interpret these shlokas from two standpoints. One is from the standpoint of the realized soul. These are all natural characteristics of the realized soul. And on the other hand, they are things that need to be cultivated by all spiritual aspirants, by all sincere sadhakas and sadhikas. Any questions? So I really like that observation. At the same time, the interesting thing about these commentators is they'll have these wonderful insights, and then the next minute they'll sometimes seem to be giving a bit weird interpretations. So I find that, so another thing Shankara says about slokas 55 all the way up to the end of the chapter is that they are descriptions of the all-renouncing sannyasi, one who has renounced all actions other than jnana yoga, which is shravana, manana, nididhyasana, thinking about this great Mahavakya, I am that Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, and you reflect on that teaching and you try to internalize that teaching. And you can beg for food. He's willing to admit that much for the sannyasin. Other than that, no question of battles and anything like that. You see what I mean? So Shankara says that Bhagavan Krishna is describing here the all-renouncing sannyasi. And it's an open question whether that's really a plausible interpretation, especially remember the context. Arjuna he doesn't want to fight in this war, and Krishna is trying to persuade him to fight in this war. If suddenly he starts describing the characteristics of a sannyasi, how is that going to be relevant to Arjuna's situation? That's the question. This is why there's quite a few other commentators, traditional commentators, and many modern scholars think that this is not very plausible as an interpretation of these slokas. And Sri Aurobindo again gives a very useful, a very nice counterpoint to Shankara here. I already read it actually. I read it out to you. But remember, what does Sri Aurobindo says? This is a samadhi in which the attention is drawn inward even when acting outwardly. This seems to be arguably the more plausible interpretation. You don't have to renounce external action in order to achieve these states of the highest illumination. This seems to be Krishna's message, according to Sri Aurobindo. I find this more plausible. I'll leave it up to you guys which one you think is more plausible. And Ramanuja, I've mentioned this several times, but I'll just remind you one more time. For Ramanuja, the highest spiritual practice is what? Bhakti Yoga. We're only in chapter 2 of the Gita. So far, there doesn't seem to have been a single mention of bhakti. We're going to get to that. Maybe not today, but we'll see. It's already 7:15 because of the technical difficulties. But in any case, so far, he interprets this whole chapter 2 as not focusing at all on bhakti. There's a little bit where he says that there's some bhakti, but in general, it's jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. With the aim of what? Realizing that we are eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex. So he interprets slokas 55 all the way to the end of the chapter, 72, to be the characteristics of somebody who, through the practice of jnana yoga, has realized his or her true nature as an eternal divine soul separate from the body-mind complex. This is Ramanuja's interpretation. What's the purpose of having this realization? This is not the highest spiritual goal, according to Ramanuja. But you have to attain that state. You have to realize yourself as an eternal soul in order to then practice bhakti yoga. You cannot feel devotion for God, for the personal God, until you have realized your true identity as a soul separate from the body-mind complex. This is Ramanuja's idea. And you think, chapter 2, it's not a coincidence, it's a very early chapter in the Bhagavad Gita. Why? So that's why Bhagavan Krishna is first explaining this. It's like prerequisites in USC. I'm sure you have certain classes that are prerequisites to go on to higher courses. Like that. First you do Jnana Yoga, then you achieve the goal of Jnana Yoga, which is Atma Avalokanam, according to Ramanuja, which means realizing yourself as an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. That's a prerequisite for practicing Bhakti Yoga, which is contemplation, incessant contemplation of God, of Vishnu. Which will come later in the Gita. So one virtue of Ramanuja's reading is that he's also taking into account the structure of the Bhagavad Gita and how the Gita unfolds in the course of 700 shlokas. It says bhakti comes, but it comes later. What does it mean? It's a higher practice for which there are certain prerequisites. One of which is Jnana Yoga. Another one is Karma Yoga, which we talked about in previous classes. So this is Ramanuja's interpretation. think we can talk about maybe one more shloka, one or two. Let's see. So let's please move on to shloka 56. Dukkheshu anudvignamanaha sukheshu vigatasprihaha vitaraga bhayakrodaha itadhihi muniruchyate. Dukkheshu, this is, I'm just looking at the Anvaya now. Dukkheshu means in the midst of all sorts of sorrows, sufferings. Anudvignamanaha, the mind remains completely unaffected, undisturbed. Sukheshu, in the midst of the greatest pleasures. Vigataspriyaha, the mind is completely free from desire. Vita raga bhaya krodaha. Vita means without, completely devoid of what? Raga, any kinds of attachments or desires. Bhaya, everyone knows this. Fear. Krodha, anger. Completely free from any of these characteristics. Munihi, the great sage, the realized soul. Stitadihi, who has a firm intelligence, a steady intelligence. Or that person is called a person of steady intelligence. That sage is called the person of steady wisdom. One thing I like is Shankara's commentary on that second phrase in the first line. Sukheshu vigataspriyaha. In the midst of the greatest pleasures, the mind is completely free from desires. And he gives a nice metaphor. He says, this is unlike fire, which, what happens when you throw ghee into a fire? Clarified butter. It increases. This is the predicament, this is the case with ordinary people, people who are not realized, who are still ignorant of God. What happens? When objects of desire come in front of us, what happens? The desire intensifies. This is natural. And in fact, there's a beautiful shloka in the Bhagavata Purana. We were talking about this. This is considered to be the greatest scripture by Vaishnavas, Gaudiya Vaishnavas, Chaitanya school. There's a beautiful shloka. Na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogena shamyati habisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vivadate. Na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogena shamyati. Whatever desires you have, you can never satisfy those desires through bhoga. Upabhogena shamyati. Bhoga means through enjoyment. Never. It's like a law. It's a psychological law. Why? Habisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vivadate. Same metaphor as Shankara, the one that Shankara is using. If you have a fire and you cast ghee into the fire, what happens? The fire increases. In the same way, think, there's this Rashagulla in this, I'm Bengali, so I say Rashagulla. Actually, it's not my favorite. Let's say Rashamalai, that's my favorite. So Rashamalai. I see big, beautiful Rashamalai in the store, and I look at it, and now I have desire for the Rashamalai. And then the logic is, immediately, let me have it. When I have it, I'll be satisfied. So I rush into the store, I pay whatever it takes to get it, and I eat it. And then what happens? I'm not satisfied. I want another one. But let's say I have another one, and I start getting sick of it. It's a law of diminishing returns in economics. So the first taste is the most delicious. Second round, not quite as good. But then it eventually becomes a kind of addiction. But you're never satisfied. That's the problem with trying to fulfill desires through enjoyment. You never succeed. Nobody in this world has ever succeeded in doing this. That's the law. And now that's the miracle of this enlightened soul. Because in the midst of all these pleasures, that person is completely devoid of all desires. This person, this enlightened soul, doesn't play this fool's game of rushing headlong into enjoyments, thinking foolishly and wrongly, that through enjoyment, his desires or her desires will be extinguished. Because this person has viveka. He understands the truth of things, which is that this is not the path to contentment and happiness. So I like Shankara's insight here. Okay, well, let's do one more. So, Shloka 57. And then we'll do a very brief meditation. Yah sarvatra anabhisnehas tat prapya shubha shubham na bhinandati na dveshti tasya prajna pratishtita. Anvaya, yaha, that person who, sarvatra, everywhere, anabhisneha, has no, sarvatra here is not everywhere, but in all things, has absolutely no attachments or desires. Anabhisneha, sneha, love or desire, attachment. Tat shubha ashubham prapya, attaining either what is extremely pleasant and auspicious, and also when you're confronted with things which are extremely unpleasant. But in no case is this person affected by anything happening around him or her. This is, remember, these are the characteristics of an illumined soul. Na abhinandati, that person does not rejoice when confronted with the shubha, that which is wonderful. Not dveshti, and this person does not hate, does not grieve, does not feel repulsed when this person is faced with ashubha, things which are ashubha, things which are not good. Tasya prajna pratishtita. If that person behaves in this way, then you know that that person is a prajna pratishtita, that this is a person whose intelligence is firmly established, very steady and firmly established. This is the idea. And remember, I mentioned to you that Sridhara is one of the few traditional commentators who somehow tries to interpret these shlokas as directly responding to Arjuna's question about the external signs. So can any of you guess which one he takes this shloka to answer? Remember the three questions. How does the enlightened person speak? How does he sit? How does he walk? Which one? Take your guess here. Yeah, how do you, well, what's your thinking about that? How did you arrive at that? Or why do you think speak rather than the other two? Huh?
I don't think it can be siddha.
Okay, right. Okay, I see. So you're ruling out. It's by the rule of elimination. So yeah, process of elimination. It can't be sitting or walking. So let's go with speaking. Yeah, but it's not obvious that it should be speaking, but you're right, actually. But how does he do it? This, again, this shows the ingenuity of these commentators. What Sridhara says, look at the beginning, the first phrase of the second line. Na abhinandati na dveshti. Na abhinandati na dveshti. Abhinandati means rejoicing. How does he take it? Praise. Something that, to praise somebody means you do it verbally. So he takes abhinandati to mean that person does not praise, nor does he dveshti. And here, instead of taking it as an internal state of repulsion, he takes it to mean criticize, which again is a verbal thing. That person also doesn't criticize anybody. Doesn't praise anybody, he also doesn't criticize anybody. Again, the question is this a really plausible interpretation of Abhinandati? But it's very clever that he's trying somehow, by hook or by crook, to interpret these shlokas as directly answering Arjuna's question. He's on a little bit firmer ground. This is a slight of a pun, actually. I didn't even mean the pun, but we're going to get to this eventually, maybe next class. 61 uses the word asita. So the same word as is used in Arjuna's question, means sitting. So there, Sridhara pounces on that. So see, this is his answer to, 61 is his answer to, how does the enlightened person sit? Because it says, yukta asita matparaha. But even here, it's open to interpretation. I mean, is it really physical sitting, or is it talking about something more metaphorical? Anyway, I just wanted to flag here, and we'll end on this note, that Sridhara, he takes shloka 57 to be a direct answer to Arjuna's question. How does the illumined person speak? How does he speak? Sridhara says he doesn't praise anybody, but he also doesn't criticize anybody. Okay? All right. So on that note, why don't let's end with a brief meditation. Yeah, we're stopping on shloka 57 today, and we'll continue with shloka 58. Yeah. So please close your eyes. It's not quite as nice for meditation. In the past, we were upstairs, we were sitting on the floor and we could, yeah. But anyway, let's do our best. You know, old people, when they visit our temples, they have trouble sitting because of their knees. And so they sit on chairs. And so we'll pretend that we're 80 years old. Gently close your eyes. Focus your mind on the heart center. Visualize a divine light. That divine light is your eternal soul. That is your true nature. Let's meditate on that divine light, which is our eternal soul. So I'll repeat Om, and please chant it with me. Slowly chanting Om. Gently open your eyes. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Thank you, everyone. We have to turn off the recording.